Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history falls apart quietly and somehow still manages to put you to sleep. Tonight, we're drifting back more than 3,000 years to a moment when the ancient world ended without anyone realizing it. It's a story of glittering palaces, trade routes that reached across continents, and kings who called each other brother in letters carved into clay. A story that begins in harmony and ends in silence. We call it the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean apocalypse that erased entire civilizations, one slow disaster at a time. But before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let the world around you fade to quiet. Dim the lights. Maybe let a small hum of the night keep you company. If you're lying down, feel the weight of your body sink a little deeper into the bed, as if the earth itself were remembering you. If you're sitting, breathe slowly and let your shoulders fall. There's nothing to solve tonight. If your mind drifts, that's fine. History has a way of waiting patiently. So when you're ready, we'll step softly into the warm, gleaming world that existed just before it all began to fall apart. The Bronze Age didn't end with one great explosion or a single war. It unraveled, slowly, almost politely, until cities burned, letters stopped arriving, and the sea grew quiet with too many shipwrecks. It's a story about trade, weather, and the dangerous art of believing stability lasts forever. Let's start there, at the height of confidence, when everything still glittered and no one could imagine that it might not. You wake up to a world made of metal and sunlight. The hills of Greece gleam with fortresses. The palaces of Anatolia hum with scribes. Egypt's temples reflect the light of a steady sun that no one believes will ever fade. Everywhere you look, things appear certain. Grain moves, ships arrive, kings exchange gifts, and the air smells faintly of copper. This is the late Bronze Age, around 1200 years before the beginning of our calendar, a time that feels permanent only because no one has seen it end yet. Bronze is what makes it possible. A simple alloy, copper and tin, two elements that never seem rare until the trade routes that carry them begin to falter. Together they make a metal soft enough to shape, strong enough to cut, and beautiful enough to build a civilization on. It's hard to imagine that something as small as a missing shipment of tin could undo entire empires. But that's the secret behind every age of progress. The one thing it can't afford to lose always feels trivial right up until it disappears. You would have seen ships crowding the harbours, long narrow hulls filled with amphorae and wooden crates sealed with wax. They carry copper from Cyprus, tin from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, and glass beads that once shimmered in workshops along the Aegean. It was by every measure the first global economy, a web so wide that a drought in Anatolia could raise the price of swords in Crete. Merchants didn't think of themselves as heroes of globalization, they just followed profit and wind. But in the process, they stitched the ancient Mediterranean into a single nervous system, one that could feel pain everywhere when something went wrong anywhere. And yet, for now, everything looks calm. In the palaces of Mycenae, frescoes show warriors riding in bright chariots, their horses painted with flowing manes, their wheels like suns in motion. Inside, scribes press reed styluses into wet clay, turning human need into inventory. Jars of oil, rolls of linen, oxen, slaves, grain. Each tablet dries in the heat, becomes permanent, and joins the thousands already stacked in the archives. In Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, letters arrive daily from Egypt and Babylon, sealed in small clay envelopes that crack open with a faint dry sound. "Brother," they begin, "may your health be strong and your gods attentive. Please send the tin." Correspondence of kings sounds polite, but every line hides anxiety. The palaces depend on one another's abundance, and the network is only as strong as its weakest port. At Ugarit, a merchant city on the coast of modern Syria, the markets smell of cedar resin and fish. Caravans come down from the mountains. Ships from Cyprus unload copper ingots shaped like ox hides. The streets are loud with hammering and trade. Every evening the harbour glows orange from 100 small fires, metal melting, bronze being reborn. No one knows it yet, but within a few generations those same flames will light the city for the last time. For now, though, the Bronze Age believes in itself. Its gods are many, its bureaucracy confident, its letters optimistic. The kings of Egypt and Hatti send gifts, golden bowls, carved ivory boxes, precious oils, not as tokens of friendship, but as proof that civilization still has the energy to be extravagant. Luxury is the public face of security. You measure peace by how many perfumes you can import, and underneath it all lies the illusion that what is large cannot fall, that because every palace has its scribes, every harbour its fleet, and every god its temple, the order of things must be eternal. No one can imagine that the system itself, the invisible threads of trade, climate, and trust, might fray all at once. People rarely believe they are living in a fragile moment. They believe they are living in history's centre, not its edge. Still, there are quiet warnings. A scribe records smaller harvests. A trader notes that a shipment arrived late. A king complains that the copper was poor quality this year. The signs are there, but they look like normal problems, until the normal becomes permanent. The world of bronze is brilliant, but brittle. It shines easily, scratches easily, and depends entirely on its ingredients getting along. The same could be said for the civilizations that wield it. They've mastered the art of turning sunlight and ore into weapons, but not the art of surviving without them. And so the late Bronze Age glows like a sunset, beautiful, expansive, and quietly finite. If you could stand on a hill overlooking the Mediterranean that evening, you might think the world had finally found balance. But history, like metal, changes temperature faster than it cools. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the winds are already shifting. The letters will soon darken. The ships will stop coming. And in the silence that follows, you'll hear the faint crack of something larger than a kingdom breaking. You could draw the entire Bronze Age on a map, not with borders or flags, but with lines of trade. Copper flows from the mines of Cyprus, tin from the far mountains beyond Mesopotamia, grain from Egypt, timber from the green shoulders of Lebanon. Together they weave a living web, stretched across the Aegean and the Levant like the strings of a harp. If one string tightens, the others hum in sympathy, and if one snaps, the song changes for everyone. A merchant in this world doesn't think of himself as part of a system. He just knows that somewhere beyond the horizon lies someone who needs what he carries. On the island of Cyprus, men dig deep into the earth for red copper that smells faintly of blood and salt. It is loaded into ox-hide-shaped ingots, great metal pancakes weighing as much as a man. They're stacked carefully in the hold of a ship, cushioned with wood and cloth, like sleeping animals waiting for the sea. Each ship becomes a floating promise. If it reaches port, the palace will have tools, weapons, ornaments, and life will continue to move. If it doesn't, the promise dissolves into waves and rumour. Far to the east, beyond the rivers of Babylon and the dry hills of Iran, lies the region that supplies tin, the element that gives copper its strength and purpose. It travels hundreds of leagues by caravan, passing through kingdoms that speak in different tongues, but share one language of trade, weight, purity, and debt. Tin is light, precious, and more expensive than gold by weight, because the world cannot make bronze without it. To the palace accountants of Mycenae and Ugarit, this is not just metal. It is the invisible lifeline of their entire civilization. They don't know the name of the miners who dig it, or the shape of the mountains where it sleeps. But they know the routes, the costs, the taxes, and the time it should take to arrive. That knowledge is their comfort and their blindness. One ship in particular, the Uluburun, carried almost everything this network could offer. It sank off the coast of what is now Turkey more than 3,000 years ago, preserved by salt and luck. When divers found it, they discovered 10 tons of copper, 1 ton of tin, and a museum of ancient luxury: elephant tusks, glass beads, scarabs, gold rings, and jars of resin that still smell faintly sweet when opened today. The cargo list reads like the inventory of the world's first multinational corporation. Each crate was proof that Egypt traded with the Aegean, that Hittites trusted Cypriots, that everything depended on everything else. It is, in its way, a sunken portrait of global confidence. The ship never reached its destination, but its wreck survived longer than the civilizations that built it. Trade wasn't only about goods, it was about the belief that tomorrow would look like today, that caravans would keep moving, harbours would stay open, and the gods would keep the wind steady. In palaces from Crete to Babylon, scribes record shipments with calm precision. 200 jars of oil received, 4 chests of copper dispatched, 3 chariots sent north to the Hittite court. The tone is the same in every tablet: dry, factual, secure. No one writes, "If the weather fails." No one writes, "If the ships do not return." When a system is this efficient, it begins to believe in its own immortality. And yet, in the small corners of those records, you can feel tiny disturbances. A letter from a merchant complains that bandits attacked the road. Another warns that the tin caravans are late. A scribe in Ugarit notes a delay in copper delivery from Cyprus. They are treated as ordinary annoyances, the kind of problems a stable world can absorb. But systems built on perfection rarely notice when perfection has already ended. The bronze trade continues, only slightly more expensive, slightly less reliable. The palaces don't worry, they have reserves. But reserves are like faith. They last until the first real test. Imagine this network of roots as the veins of a living creature. Copper flows like blood, tin like oxygen. When one artery clogs, the pulse weakens everywhere. A drought in Anatolia means less grain for export. A failed shipment of tin halts production in Mycenae. Fewer weapons mean weaker armies. Weaker armies mean lost ports. Lost ports mean no ships. It's a slow-motion chain reaction disguised as daily life. No one can see the full map. Each kingdom believes the others are still strong. It's like a row of candles, each burning brightly enough that none of them notice the breeze. The people who live inside this system have never seen it fail. Theirs is an age of letters, alliances, and mutual reassurance. Egypt's pharaoh writes to the Hittite king, "My brother, my son is well. May your gods protect you." Ugarit sends perfumes and textiles westward, receives weapons and grain in return. Every transaction is both gift and obligation. To stop trading would be to admit weakness. No palace wants to be the first to confess uncertainty. So they trade harder. More ships, more promises, more copper, more tin. The rhythm continues, louder, faster, unaware that momentum can be its own undoing. Even the sea itself seems to cooperate. In the calm seasons, its surface shines like polished bronze. Sailors steer by stars that feel permanent. They sing to the gods for safe passage, pour a little wine over the side, and imagine that nothing could go wrong in a world so orderly. But storms have a way of waiting for confidence. The same sea that connects these empires will one day swallow their ships, scatter their trade, and rewrite their coastlines. For now, though, it only reflects the illusion, bright, endless, and quiet. If you could stand on a headland at dusk and watch the merchant ships drift across the horizon, you'd see more than trade. You'd see faith disguised as economy. Every sail a declaration that the world still makes sense. Every harbour a heart that keeps beating because the others do. It's beautiful and deeply fragile. The kind of beauty that only exists when no one imagines it ending. History often looks most peaceful just before it becomes interesting. Somewhere inland, a caravan pauses to rest. The drivers feed their animals and wait for night to cool the road. They don't know they're carrying the lifeblood of an age about to end. They only know the route, the price, and the promise. Copper and tin, two simple elements that hold the world together, until they don't. The map of the Bronze Age isn't drawn in ink or stone. It's drawn in movement, in ships crossing open water, in the sound of hammer on metal, in the rustle of parchment and the clink of scales. It's a map of faith disguised as trade, a geometry of trust. And like all maps, it looks perfectly complete, right until the moment it burns. Long before paper, long before ink or emails that vanish into the void, the kings of the late Bronze Age had their own network, a system that connected Egypt, Babylon, Hattusa and Ugarit through baked clay. A diplomatic internet powered by scribes and sun. Every day, envoys crossed deserts and seas carrying small tablets wrapped in linen, each stamped with the same fragile faith that the message would arrive before the kingdom collapsed. Inside those palaces, the air smelled of clay dust and oil lamps. Scribes sat on low stools, shaping tablets no larger than a hand. Each letter began the same way. To my brother, the great king, thus speaks. Formal, warm, endlessly repetitive, like a greeting card sent by someone who hasn't realized the world is ending. They exchanged gold, grain, and daughters. They argued about gifts, marriages, and trade routes. One pharaoh even complained that the silver bracelets he received were underweight, a polite version of leaving a bad review. It was bureaucracy with poetry. The Amarna letters from Egypt read like diplomatic small talk. My brother, may your gods favour you. Please send more horses. Also, we're short on wood again. The tone is calm, confident, almost cosy. No one sounds worried because worry is impolite, among gods in human form. But behind that politeness, you can sense something quieter, the fatigue of an age managing its own complexity. So many routes, so many treaties, so many tiny problems to smooth over with gifts and good manners. In Ugarit, the archives grew like coral reefs. Thousands of tablets neatly stacked, each one a snapshot of a conversation between distant powers. A typical message might travel weeks or months, bouncing between cities, handed from courier to courier. When the reply finally arrived, the topic was often obsolete, but protocol demanded an answer anyway, so the conversation never really stopped. The late Bronze Age was, in many ways, an empire of correspondence, built on clay, carried by hope. And clay, as it turns out, has a long memory. When Ugarit and Hattusa burned, their archives baked harder in the heat. The fire that destroyed their civilizations also preserved their voices for eternity. That's why we can still read them now, kings greeting each other as beloved brothers while their cities crumbled. The irony writes itself. The First World system recorded its own demise line by line in permanent handwriting. Not every letter was polite. Some sound desperate. A Hittite king writes to his vassal, "The enemy has attacked. Send troops at once." Another tablet from Ugarit pleads for grain. "My fields yield nothing. My people are starving." And one final message never delivered simply says, "The enemy ships are approaching." It was found half-baked in the kiln, the words frozen mid-sentence. History's first unsent email. In Egypt, diplomacy was almost theatrical. Pharaohs measured prestige in tons of gold and the number of foreign princesses they could collect as wives. One letter to a Babylonian king complains that he hasn't sent his daughter yet. Another insists that Egyptian gold is pure, despite rumours to the contrary. The tone is somewhere between flirtation and economic negotiation. Power, in this world, is written in gifts: ivory boxes, perfumed oils, lapis lazuli. Every exchange says the same thing. We're still rich, we're still stable, we're still worth talking to. Yet the more letters they wrote, the more fragile their confidence became. The correspondence grows heavier toward the end of the century, longer, more urgent, full of subtle panic disguised as formality. They keep saying peace between us, which usually means the opposite. Behind the greetings, there's a trace of exhaustion, as if everyone is pretending that business as usual can save them from whatever is coming. It's a tone every civilization eventually learns. Imagine a clerk in one of those palaces sealing a tablet with the royal mark. He doesn't know that this archive, this room, this entire system will soon be dust. He just wants the grammar right. The message will travel across deserts, through bandits and storms, to another clerk in another city. He'll read it, copy, hit, file it. One more whisper added to the growing mountain of clay. A monument not to power, but a communication. And when fire comes, it will turn all of it into brick. The correspondence between kings is oddly intimate. They call each other brother, even when they barely trust one another. They refer to each other's mothers, their gods, their recent illnesses. It's diplomacy wrapped in affection, but affection designed by accountants. When a shipment of horses arrives late, a king doesn't threaten war. He reminds his brother of their mutual friendship and the need to maintain proper respect. It's the ancient version of smiling through clenched teeth. This habit of written reassurance becomes a kind of ritual against chaos. Every new treaty, every cargo list, every gift is a charm to keep the system alive. No one calls it faith, but that's what it is. Faith in roads, in ships, in scribes, in the gods who keep the wind blowing in the right direction. A belief that if you just keep writing, the world will keep listening. But the clay starts to tell another story. The letters from the last decades of the Bronze Age grow darker. Mentions of raids, delayed shipments, refugees crossing borders. The tone shifts from politeness to pleading. When one king writes, "I have no grain in my lands," it's not just a complaint about famine, it's a confession of collapse. A letter sent too late, asking for help that will never arrive. In that sense, these archives are less about the glory of empires and more about their loneliness. Each tablet, a voice calling out across distances that had suddenly become too large. Each courier, a moving prayer, and somewhere along those dusty roads, a messenger carrying a royal plea for tin or food would have seen the smoke of another city on the horizon. The same smoke that will one day bake the very message he carries. When modern archaeologists unearthed these letters, they found not just data, but tone. A civilization so convinced of its stability that it wrote its own obituary without realizing it. The clay preserves it all. The promises, the gossip, the despair, even the grammar, and through it, we hear the sound of a world that tried to stay polite while falling apart. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The soft tap of stylus on clay, the murmur of scribes, the distant echo of chariot wheels in palace courtyards. A world still writing, still talking, even as the lights begin to dim. Because in the Bronze Age, silence was the one thing no one planned for. If you lived in the late Bronze Age, you would not have needed to imagine what power looked like. You could see it, hear it, and even smell it. It was in the walls of the palaces, thick, painted, echoing with footsteps and orders. It was in the courtyards where oxen were led in for sacrifice, and in the storerooms where grain piled like small golden hills. It was also in the sound of writing, styluses pressing into clay, one careful mark after another, until a day's worth of human labour became an entry in the ledger of a king. These palaces were not homes, they were machines. Their purpose was to take what the countryside produced and turn it into something that looked like civilization. Food into feasts or into weapons, taxes into obedience. Every object had a place, every person a duty, every harvest a number in a tablet somewhere. If you were a peasant, you grew barley for the palace. If you were a craftsman, you forged tools for the palace. If you were a soldier, you fought for the palace. It fed you, paid you, judged you, and, when necessary, buried you. The palace was not just where the ruler lived, it was how the world worked. Inside, the rhythm was constant. Messengers arriving, scribes reading, stewards counting, guards pacing. At the top of it all sat the king, not a man so much as the beating heart of the system. His titles filled an entire tablet: chosen of the gods, beloved of the storm, master of wheat and wine, shepherd of the people, destroyer of his enemies. It sounded impressive, but it also sounded exhausting. Most of his days were spent signing things. The palace economy was remarkably efficient. Farmers sent their crops to storage. Scribes measured them out to soldiers and labourers. Bronze tools came in, wool, linen and oil went out. A network of overseers managed each task, ensuring that the palace always knew exactly what it owned, and who owed it something. Even the dead had records. Every death meant a tablet noting what would happen to the land, the animals and the remaining family. In this way, the Bronze Age invented bureaucracy long before anyone thought to complain about it. If civilization had a heartbeat, it was probably shaped like a spreadsheet. To stand in one of these storerooms would have felt like standing inside order itself. Amphorae filled with oil, jars packed with grain, bundles of linen wrapped in reed mats, each one marked with a seal. The air heavy with the smell of barley and resin, a quiet pride in the idea that nothing could be lost because everything was counted. The palaces measured their success not by freedom or beauty, but by inventory. To them, a perfect society was one where nothing was missing. But perfection, as always, is a terrible habit. The more the system succeeded, the more delicate it became. When trade routes began to falter, when a shipment of tin arrived late or not at all, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crack in the foundation. Bronze tools became harder to replace, soldiers harder to arm, fields harder to till. The scribes noticed, of course, but their job was to count, not to predict. A missing number on a tablet did not look like a warning, it looked like a clerical error. And yet the warning signs grew. The tablets show it. Subtle changes in tone, quiet notes in margins, less copper received, grain quotas unmet, livestock missing. We can read the moment the machine begins to grind against itself. The same precision that once made it strong now makes it slow to adapt. The palace can command loyalty and labour, but not rainfall or trade winds. It can tax farmers, but not invent tin. It can write decrees, but not stop a drought. The irony is that the palaces had built the most organised world anyone had ever seen, and in doing so, they removed the ability to improvise. Every task had a protocol, every decision a precedent, every solution a ceremony. When something unexpected happened, they wrote about it. And while they wrote, the crisis deepened. You can almost imagine a scribe pausing, stylus hovering over the clay, wondering whether to record the truth or the version his overseer expected to hear. Bureaucracy depends on optimism. Without it, no one shows up to count. To the people outside the palace walls, things looked different. For farmers, a bad harvest meant hunger. For merchants, a missed shipment meant debt. For soldiers, a smaller ration meant suspicion and anger. They didn't see the system as elegant. They saw it as distant, heavy, and blind, a giant that never looked down. And when giants fall, they fall on everyone nearby. Still, from the inside, the machine looked eternal. The king held ceremonies to reassure his gods. Priests read omens in the flight of birds, the colour of entrails, the direction of the wind. If the signs were good, life continued. If the signs were bad, more sacrifices were made until they weren't. It was a self-correcting belief system, as long as you ignored the smoke on the horizon. Archaeologists have found layers of ash in nearly every major palace site from this era. Dark bands of carbon that sliced through centuries of calm like a scar. But before the fire came, there was always paper, or rather clay, Records, receipts, decrees, lists of workers, lists of gods, lists of debts. Even at the edge of destruction, the scribes kept writing. Their last act wasn't flight, it was filing. If you could walk through those ruins today, you'd still sense the structure beneath the silence. Corridors that once echoed with the sound of sandals and bronze bells. Storerooms where amphorae once stood, shoulder to shoulder like soldiers. The machine is gone, but its outline remains, perfect in its emptiness. You can almost feel the hum of a system that once believed counting was the same as control. The palace, in the end, didn't die from neglect or rebellion. It died of precision. It had built a world so efficient that when one gear slipped, the rest followed in obedient ruin. No one saw it as collapse at first, only delay, shortage, temporary confusion. The letters kept going out, the ledgers kept being updated, and somewhere in the archives a final tablet was pressed with a royal seal, its words still warm as the first sparks touched the roof beams above. The machine had worked beautifully right up until the moment it stopped. It began quietly, as most disasters do. No lightning, no armies, no warnings written across the sky, only a season that arrived late and left early. The rivers sank lower, the wells whispered their last, the ground hardened beneath the hooves of animals waiting for grass that never came. At first, people said it was temporary. Seasons wander, clouds lose their way, the gods test the faithful. But then another year passed, and the clouds still didn't come back. What we know now comes not from myths or letters, but from dust itself. The tiny memories of pollen trapped in mud at the bottom of lakes. Those grains are the ghosts of vanished springtimes, small enough to fit on a needlepoint, stubborn enough to outlast empires. When scientists look at them today, they can see how the variety of plants narrowed suddenly. Olives and barley, the crops that once defined the Mediterranean, almost vanish in the record. It's as if the landscape simply forgot how to bloom. No one then could have known they were living through the longest drought in centuries. They only knew the wind had changed its voice. In some valleys, farmers tried digging their irrigation canals deeper. In others, they gave up and moved toward the coast. The letters that survive from that time begin to sound anxious. A Hittite official writes that the granaries are empty. A merchant from Ugarit pleads for grain shipments. One desperate king confesses, "My people die of hunger." Even now the words feel heavy, as though they were written with dust instead of ink. Civilization had learned how to count everything except thirst. Up in the far north, in what we now call Iceland, a mountain woke. It had no name to the people of the Mediterranean, but its breath reached them anyway. When the volcano we call Hekla erupted, it exhaled a cloud so vast that the sunlight dimmed for years. The air turned cooler, the rains weaker. Trees from Ireland to Anatolia show the mark of it. Narrow rings, each one a year of stunted growth. You can still see those lines under a microscope, like scars recording a long cold sigh. No one in Egypt or Greece ever saw the mountain, but they lived inside its shadow. A northern whisper changed the temperature of the world, and the world, being what it is, didn't explain why. To the priests and kings, this wasn't geology. It was judgment. They prayed louder, sacrificed more, and invented new ceremonies to remind the gods they still existed. But when the sky has stopped listening, even incense loses its meaning. The temples filled with smoke, but the clouds stayed empty. The sun shone with a pale, flat light, like a coin rubbed smooth by too many hands. In the countryside, wells turned brackish. Fish vanished from the shallows, children grew up shorter, thinner, quieter. When you picture the Bronze Age, you might imagine gold masks and gleaming chariots, but most of it was this: families staring at a horizon that refused to turn green. When the crops failed, people ate their seed grain, then their animals, then each other's patience. The palaces responded the only way they knew. They sent letters. Send barley, send oil, send help. and somewhere across the sea someone else wrote the same message back. The scientists who study these years find evidence everywhere. Layers of silt thickened by dust storms, salt crusts in ancient wells, pollen from plants that thrive only in arid heat. Translated into simple words, it all says the same thing. The rain forgot its schedule. For perhaps 20 years, maybe longer, the skies failed to deliver what civilization assumed would always come. In that time, the equations of survival changed completely. One missing monsoon in the east meant no grain for Babylon. A dry river in Anatolia meant no fodder for Hittite horses. The web that connected the ancient world began to dry from the edges inward. Still, people adapted, for a while. Egypt turned to irrigation on a grand scale, carving channels along the Nile that glittered like mirrors in the sun. Farmers prayed to the river as if it were a god, because in a sense it was. But even the Nile grew unpredictable. Some years it flooded too much, drowning the fields, others not at all. When the water becomes a gambler, the harvest becomes a rumour. In the north, shepherds abandoned the highlands, driving their herds toward the coasts. Villages emptied slowly. A child born in one of those years might grow up never seeing a full harvest, never hearing the sound of rain on a roof. Generations raised under silence. The kings continued to perform confidence. They built new statues, held festivals, announced victories over invisible enemies. But beneath the hymns, something was breaking. Grain was no longer plentiful enough to support armies. The bronze trade faltered because fewer ships could risk the empty harbours. Starving sailors make poor merchants, and merchants who can't find buyers make excellent refugees. Every failed voyage sent a ripple through the network, each one smaller, sadder, harder to hide. If the climate had shifted only for a season, history might have forgotten it. But 20 years of thin harvests is enough to unlearn prosperity. When the sun dimmed slightly, it dimmed the confidence of a continent. And while the sky forgot to rain, people began to forget the sound of stability. In the palace archives, the final entries before the collapse are strangely specific. 2 jars short, 4 workers missing, 5 days without bread. Even as famine spread, the scribes kept counting. There is comfort in arithmetic when the weather stops keeping its promises. Numbers feel solid, even when the ground does not. But numbers can't coax a cloud to form. Archaeologists today can see the physical evidence, the thin lines of sediment, the microscopic layers of ash. But none of them can measure the exact moment when people realised the problem wasn't temporary. Maybe it was when the first caravan didn't return. Maybe when the last well went dry. Or maybe it was gradual, like forgetting a song, the world losing its rhythm, note by note. By the end of this long drought, the fields had turned to pale dust. The mountains that once shimmered with green were stripped to stone. And somewhere, perhaps in a small village now buried under centuries of silence, a farmer looked at the sky and stopped expecting it to change. Civilizations rarely die in storms, they die in stillness. And for the late Bronze Age, the stillness began with the sound of nothing falling from the clouds. You can survive bureaucracy, you can survive war, but not a weather forecast that says forever dry. When the rain stopped, trade stopped listening too. A dry field meant no surplus, and no surplus meant no merchants at the docks. The Bronze Age ran on movement, carts, caravans, ships, and when the movement slowed, the world began to forget what wealth even looked like. No one planned the collapse. It unfolded the way dust spreads, quietly, invisibly, until it covers everything. In Cyprus, where copper mines once rang with the sound of hammers, the forges cooled. The miners packed their tools, left their lamps burning in the tunnels, and walked away. The ingots that did make it to the port sat unsold because there was no tin to mix with them. Bronze, the metal that built the age, had become a recipe with a missing ingredient. You could still melt copper, still admire its colour, but it was too soft to make a weapon, too dull to make a crown. Somewhere between one shipment and the next, civilization misplaced its alloy. Trade ships once crossed the Mediterranean like clockwork, carrying wood, wine, and metal from one coast to another. Now harbours were silent, their ropes fraying in the sun. A ship that leaves a starving port is a ship that might not return, and sailors are quick learners. One by one, the sea routes emptied. Merchants turned to overland roads, but those too became dangerous. Bandits in the hills, dried wells, no kingdoms left rich enough to patrol the borders. Each lost trade route was a broken thread in a vast invisible web, and when enough threads snap, the web doesn't sag, it vanishes. The palaces tried to keep pretending. Kings sent letters to their allies. Do not delay the copper, the shipment is late. But each letter was a message in a bottle, drifting toward another shore that was already burning. Ugarit sent grain requests to Cyprus. Cyprus sent copper to the Hittites. The Hittites sent horses to Egypt. Egypt sent gold to Babylon. And then, one season, nothing came back. No replies, no ships, only rumours. It was like listening to a conversation that fades into static and never resumes. Economies, like stories, depend on faith. As long as everyone believes tomorrow will resemble today, coins have value, contracts have meaning, and ships keep sailing. But when the belief wavers, the entire system starts to wobble. In the Bronze Age, there was no money as we know it, just promises measured in metal and time. When the metal stopped moving, so did the time. The world discovered what happens when trust itself runs out of fuel. In a palace storeroom somewhere in Anatolia, scribes were still recording shipments that would never arrive. 40 amphorae of oil pending delivery. 3 ox hide ingots delayed by weather. But the weather was not the problem anymore. Outside those walls, the farmers had already gone to the hills, taking their tools, their families, and whatever could still grow in thin soil. The palace had become a warehouse for unclaimed goods, a museum of a future no one would live to see. Archaeologists today find traces of that pause. Warehouses filled with goods that were never distributed. Sealed jars of grain left untouched, perhaps because there was no one left to issue the orders. Unfinished statues, half-built ships, markets abandoned mid-transaction. It's the archaeology of interruption. The moment when activity freezes, not because people die all at once, but because they run out of reasons to continue. The domino effect was relentless. Without trade, bronze production collapsed. Without bronze, weapons grew scarce. Without weapons, kingdoms couldn't defend their ports. Without ports, trade vanished completely. It was the first known example of what modern economists might call systemic failure, though no one then would have used that phrase. They just knew that everything familiar was suddenly too expensive, too late, or too far away. The letters that survive from this time sound like echoes. My brother, the ships have not returned. The tin has not arrived. My people are weak. Each one written by someone who still believed someone else might be listening. But the distance between sender and receiver was measured now not in miles, but in hunger. In the cities, desperation began to take physical form. Walls went unmaintained, roads cracked. The guards, unpaid, started looting what they used to protect. Refugees appeared, families carrying bundles of grain, begging entry at city gates already struggling to feed their own, and every gatekeeper faced the same impossible choice: open the doors and starve together, or close them and be haunted by the silence outside. The sea, once a glittering highway of commerce, turned hostile. Storms came more often. The harbours silted over. The gods of the winds, once trusted to bring profit, now brought only wreckage. On the beaches of Crete, broken amphorae and rotting timbers marked where ships had washed ashore. The same ships that once carried copper and tin now carried only memory. From a distance, the collapse looked sudden, a bright civilization snuffed out overnight. Up close, it's slower, sadder, almost polite. A ship delayed here, a famine. There, a caravan that never arrives. The world kept breathing, just shallower each year. It wasn't one apocalypse. It was thousands of small forgettings that eventually added up to silence. In the ruins of one coastal warehouse, archaeologists found a room full of unused copper ingots stacked against the wall. 10 tons of gleaming red metal, waiting for a shipment of tin that would never come. You can still see the marks of hands that once carried them, the scratches of tools that measured them. To anyone standing there 3,000 years ago, it would have felt temporary, the pause before recovery. But that pause lasted forever. Some historians call this period the world's first recorded recession. But it was more than that. It was the moment humanity learned how fragile a network can be when it stretches too far. They had created a world too interconnected to survive disconnection. And yet, for all the grandeur of the fall, it didn't look like a collapse from the inside, it looked like waiting. When a spider web breaks, it doesn't collapse in one grand gesture. It simply fails to hold. And in the quiet after, the air seems empty, though it's only that the pattern is gone. That was the Bronze Age, a pattern, once perfect, now invisible. A silence built of copper, promises, and vanished rain. The city of Hattusa sat high in the Anatolian hills, where the wind moved like a steady drumbeat through the stone gates. For centuries it had been the centre of the Hittite world, a place of carved lions, thick walls, and archives so vast they needed entire rooms just to store the clay tablets. It was a city of order and authority built to look permanent, but permanence, like bronze, is only an illusion that shines in the right light. On the morning it ended, there were no omens beyond the usual. The priests lit incense to the storm god, the scribes copied orders, and the guards made their rounds atop the walls. If you walked through its gates that day, you might have smelled smoke from distant farms, but the world had smelled of smoke for years. By then, every horizon was a little grey. The fall of Hattusa was not a single event, but a chain of exhaustion. The empire had already shrunk, its armies scattered across too many borders, its grain stores thinned by too many poor harvests. Letters from the outer provinces spoke of raids, desertions, and fields left untended. Each report was a symptom of something the palace no longer had the strength to cure. It's hard to say exactly who struck the final blow. Perhaps local rebels, perhaps refugees turned soldiers, perhaps no one at all. Sometimes cities simply give up. What remains in the ruins tells the story in layers. First, the floor tiles cracked from heat. Then the walls collapsed inward, burying the archives beneath tons of debris. When archaeologists dug through it 3,000 years later, they found a seam of ash nearly 3 meters thick, about the height of a man and a half. Underneath lay thousands of tablets baked hard by the same fire that erased their owners. The city had burned to silence, and in that silence, it preserved its words forever. It is strange how often destruction and preservation share a flame. Each tablet pulled from that ash is a heartbeat trapped in clay. One orders horses for a royal procession, another lists rations for the palace kitchens. A few speak of gods who demand sacrifices, perhaps because the gods themselves were hungry. There is even one tablet, only partly legible, that seems to warn, "The enemy approaches the land." The scribe who pressed those marks into wet clay might have heard the first screams echoing down the valley as he worked. He sealed the tablet, set it to dry, and somewhere in that moment, the world he was writing about ended. Imagine him sitting there, the smell of smoke creeping through the window, the tremor of footsteps outside, his hands still moving, because habit can survive longer than hope. For generations, scribes had been told that words kept the kingdom alive. To stop writing would be to admit that the kingdom no longer existed. So he wrote one last tablet, one last sentence, even as the roof beams began to glow. The fire that consumed Hattusa would have been visible for miles. The cedar roofs went first, feeding the wind. Then the storerooms, full of oil and grain, turned into furnaces. The sound would not have been a roar, but a constant low thunder, broken by the collapse of walls and the pop of clay cracking under heat. People ran, stumbled, disappeared into the smoke. By morning, the empire that had ruled Anatolia for half a millennium was gone. No triumph, no enemy occupation, no rebuilding, only silence and soot. When archaeologists first uncovered the site, they celebrated. To them, it was a gift. Entire archives preserved by accident, evidence of a culture once thought lost. They brushed the ash from the tablets, catalogued the ruins, and spoke of discovery. But beneath that scholarly excitement lies an unspoken irony. Their triumph depended on someone else's catastrophe. The day the Hittites vanished was, for history, a good day for data. Civilization left its own obituary in perfect condition. There's something haunting in the geometry of the ruins. Streets that lead nowhere. Temples open to the sky. A fortress gate flanked by two great stone lions, mouths frozen mid-roar, guarding nothing but wind. When you walk there now, all you hear is the sound of bees and the dry rustle of grass between stones. The air smells faintly metallic, as if the city still remembers the taste of bronze and fire. We don't know where the survivors went. Some may have fled south to smaller towns that clung on for another generation. Others may have joined the wandering groups that would later appear on the coast. People with no homeland, no king, only the memory of walls. In that way, the ashes of Hattusa were not an end, but a beginning of something vaguer. The slow migration of the homeless into history. The destruction layer itself reads like a chronicle written by fire. At the bottom, the old floors of smooth limestone once washed and polished. Above that, fallen beams and pottery shards warped by heat. Above that, the ash, dense, grey, lifeless. And above that, silence. 3,000 years of soil, waiting for someone to dig it open and remember. The ground holds no names, only the weight of what once mattered. The fire burned fast, but forgetting took longer. For a century or two after, nearby villages still used fragments of the old walls as quarries. Children played among the ruins, climbing over stones carved with prayers no one could read. A traveller passing through around 1,000 years before our calendar might have seen nothing more than broken towers and vines, the bones of an empire too quiet to mourn. There is a kind of peace in that image. Civilizations, like people, end with the same rhythm. First noise, then heat, then quiet. Hattusa followed it perfectly. If you listen closely to the wind across those hills, you can almost hear what came last. The soft crack of clay cooling, the faint hiss of rain finally returning, too late to save anyone. Archaeologists call it a burn layer. Poets might call it memory made solid. Either way, it's the same truth. Sometimes the only way to preserve what we were is to let it burn into what we will remember. The coast of Ugarit was once the sound of business. Waves beating gently against wooden piers, merchants shouting in a dozen languages, and ships swaying in the bay like leaves on a restless pond. If Hattusa had been the head of the Bronze Age, then Ugarit was its heartbeat, quick, constant, and warm. Its warehouses brimmed with copper ingots, its markets smelled of cedar, fish, and resin. And its scribes, always its scribes, filled the air with the soft tapping of reeds against clay. Every day was a transaction, every prayer a contract, every ship a promise. The letters that survive from Ugarit tell us everything except what it felt like to stand there when the horizon caught fire. Most of them begin in the same practiced rhythm. To my lord and brother, may the gods protect you. The shipment is ready. Please send grain. It's the polite music of trade, of confidence in a world still working. But in the final letters, the tone changes. A scribe writes, The enemy ships are near. Another adds, "My fields yield no harvest." And the last one, the one we still have, ends mid-sentence, the words half-baked in the kiln when the city burned. It is, in every sense, the world's first unsent message. You can almost picture the moment. The scribe leaning forward, hair plastered with sweat, shaping words into wet clay while the city outside begins to scream. The kiln already hot, the door half open, the sky beyond the window, glowing orange, not with sunset but with ships on fire. He doesn't stop writing because that's not what scribes do. In his world, a message written is a duty fulfilled, even if there's no one left to read it. He finishes the line, places the tablet inside, and maybe, just for a second, believes that the message will reach someone across the sea. And then the roof falls. When the city was excavated in the 20th century, the archaeologists found the kiln exactly as it had been left. The tablets inside fused together by heat. Some were preserved so perfectly that you can still see fingerprints pressed into the clay. They are the fingerprints of someone who did not live to see what he had written survive. In a way, he succeeded. His words endured for 3,000 years longer than his walls. Ugarit's last days must have been chaos. The letters mention ships sighted offshore, fleets of unfamiliar sails carrying warriors whose names would one day be written on Egyptian walls as sea peoples. Whether they were refugees or invaders, no one knew. The drought had already driven whole nations onto the sea. They came with families, animals, carts and weapons, looking for land that could still feed them. The coast of Ugarit was rich, and rich places never stay quiet for long. From the ramparts, someone must have seen the glint of oars, the flash of sunlight on bronze. It would have looked beautiful just before it looked fatal. The attack, when it came, was fast. No grand siege, no months of waiting, just the sudden weight of fire. The city's cedar roofs, its warehouses full of oil, all caught instantly. Bronze weapons, when heated, can glow like gold, so the soldiers may have looked divine as they moved through the streets. The air filled with the crackle of timber, the hiss of clay tiles splitting, the sound of amphorae shattering underfoot, and above it all, the sea kept its rhythm, calm and indifferent. Somewhere in that smoke the palace burned, its archives turned red and black. Thousands of tablets, contracts, receipts, prayers, inventories, love letters, all baked to permanence, each one a record of what mattered just before nothing did. That's the strange kindness of fire. It destroys the living and preserves the written. When the archaeologists brushed away the ash, they found the city's voice still waiting to be read. Every sentence an echo of urgency, every tablet a fossil of panic. The destruction layer at Ugarit is thick, about 2 meters of debris, the height of a person standing in a room filled with smoke. Arrowheads litter the streets, mixed with broken jewellery and crushed pottery. In one house, the skeleton of a woman was found near the doorway, clutching a small bronze mirror. In another, a child's toy made of baked clay still intact. History leaves tenderness in strange places. You can almost feel the quiet that came after, the way ash softens every sound. When modern readers first translated Ugarit's letters, they were struck by how ordinary they were. The last days of a civilization read like office memos, grain shipments, tax complaints, trade agreements, no prophecy, no heroism, just routine. And yet within that routine lies the most human detail of all, the refusal to accept finality. Even as the world cracked open, they were still writing as if tomorrow existed. Perhaps that's what civilization truly is, the act of filling clay with hope, again and again until the kiln runs out of fuel. The city never recovered. When the fires cooled, the survivors fled inland. The ports filled with wreckage. For centuries afterward, the coastline remained quiet, as if the sea itself were embarrassed by what it had done. The new towns that rose nearby built their walls smaller, their archives simpler, their prayers shorter. You can tell when a culture has learned not to trust longevity. Today, if you visit the ruins of Ugarit near modern Ras Shamra, you can still walk through its streets. The air smells faintly of salt and dust. The foundations of temples remain, the doorways open to the sky. Somewhere under your feet lie the archives, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, many still unread, stacked like a library turned to stone. It's one of the few places on Earth where you can literally walk on words. Each step is a sentence, each breeze a translation of what was lost. There's a line among archaeologists that Ugarit didn't vanish. It was simply filed too well. Everything it was, it recorded. Everything it recorded, the fire kept safe. It's hard to think of a more poetic failure. A civilization so devoted to communication that even its final act was correspondence. Its last message was not defeat, but persistence. We are still writing, even if the ink was flame. When the smoke finally cleared, the harbour was silent. The water reflected only the black outlines of ships that would never sail again. And above the charred ruins, the air cooled just enough for one last sigh. The kind of sound that might be mistaken for wind, but is really history exhaling. The city that once sang in a dozen languages had gone quiet, but its words, half-baked and half-finished, still whisper through time. We were here, we spoke, and even as the fire came, we tried to say goodbye. After the fires, there was movement, first inland, then outward, then everywhere at once. The cities along the eastern Mediterranean had fallen silent, but the sea had not. From its surface came the sound of oars cutting through waves and of wind catching canvas. If you looked out from a coastal cliff, you might have seen it, a horizon lined with dark sails, small at first, then countless. They did not come from one nation or one direction. They came from hunger. Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Rameses III, tell the story in patient detail. Rows of ships, crowds of warriors, women, and children packed together, a civilization on the move. The hieroglyphs call them the Sea Peoples, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shadana, the Danuna, the Weshesh. Each name a fragment, each group carrying a past they could no longer return to. Historians still argue about where they came from. Perhaps the Aegean, perhaps the islands of Cyprus and Crete, perhaps the ruins of Hittite lands. But what they sought is easier to guess. They wanted land, food, and the quiet promise of survival. You can call them raiders if you like, but the truth sounds closer to refugees with weapons. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been a trading network. Now, it became a lifeboat. When the droughts worsened and the palaces failed, entire populations took to the water. They built new ships from broken timbers and filled them with whatever they could carry. Tools, grain, bronze weapons dulled by age. Behind them, smoke rose from the coasts. Ahead of them, the same sea that had once brought wealth now offered only uncertainty. A desperate voyage, not a conquest. When people lose their homes, they stop worrying about who the next coastline belongs to. The Egyptians, of course, saw it differently. In their carvings, these newcomers appear as invaders, their ships filled with bowmen, their shields painted with strange patterns. To Rameses III, they were a threat to order, a wave of chaos from the north. He gathered his armies along the Nile Delta, where the river meets the sea, and prepared an ambush. It was a battle born of necessity, Egypt's own survival against the tide of the displaced. But the truth behind the images carved in stone feels more complicated. An empire defending its harvest from the hungry. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show every detail. Egyptian archers stand on the riverbanks, their bows drawn. The enemy's ships are trapped in the shallows, tangled together by ropes and grappling hooks. The air must have smelled of tar and sweat and panic. The river reflects fire. The sound is a mixture of shouting and splintering wood. The Egyptians called it a victory, and in a narrow sense it was. The invaders turned back, their fleet destroyed. But Egypt's triumph came at a price it couldn't afford. Its treasury was drained, its crops thin, its soldiers unpaid. Winning did not stop the decline, it only delayed it. In the quiet years after, Egypt began to shrink. Its temples still stood, but the statues looked out over emptier lands. The same inscriptions that brag of victory also hint at weariness. Lists of rations, shorter each season. Even a pharaoh cannot rule an empire that is starving at its edges. It is possible to win a war and still lose everything that made it worth fighting. As for the sea peoples, they didn't vanish. They scattered like seeds blown across the water. Some settled along the coast of Canaan, where the soil still held a trace of life. Others moved further west, merging with local tribes, founding small settlements that would one day become cities with new names. The Peliset perhaps became the Philistines, the same people who would later trouble the Israelites and appear in Bible stories told long after anyone remembered why they'd come there in the first place. The Shadana and Jekka appear again in Egyptian records, not as enemies, but as mercenaries in the pharaoh's own army. It's a reminder that history rarely chooses sides, it only rearranges hunger. If you could have spoken to one of them, a sailor leaning against the side of a weather-beaten ship, his family asleep under rough cloth, he might not have called himself a conqueror. He might have said simply, "We had no rain, we had no land." And that would have been explanation enough. Civilization in the end is geography's hostage. Archaeologists find traces of their passing everywhere. Pottery styles appearing where they shouldn't. Weapons of mixed design. Graves with both local and foreign objects. A scatter of clues that speaks less of invasion and more of migration. The sea carried them, but also erased them. Salt water does that. It blurs the edges, mixes the stories, makes every coastline look almost the same. The only constant was the direction, toward wherever the fires hadn't yet reached. The ancient scribes, the ones who survived, never wrote their names again. The palaces that might have recorded them were already ash. To later generations, these wandering groups became a mythic problem. Faceless destroyers, barbarians from the sea. It's easier to imagine monsters than to face the thought that hunger alone can unmake empires. But the archaeology is patient. It whispers another version, that they were the orphans of a broken world, searching for somewhere to begin again. Even the Egyptians, so proud of their order, seemed to understand this in their own way. After the battle, Rameses had their images carved not as demons, but as people, women, children, oxen, wagons, the full, messy procession of displacement. It's possible the sculptor saw them up close, saw their faces, saw that desperation looks the same in every language. The gods could call it victory. The artist called it something closer to grief. By the time the smoke cleared and the waves grew calm again, the Mediterranean was a different sea. The great ports of trade were ruins. The palaces had become empty shells filled with wind. The surviving kingdoms, Egypt, Assyria, small city-states scattered like islands of endurance, now lived in a world smaller, poorer and lonelier. But beneath that quiet, something new was forming. Small villages of farmers, iron tools beginning to replace bronze, alphabets replacing cuneiform. The storm had ended, but the air still smelled of change. History remembers the sea peoples as destroyers, but in another light they were midwives, delivering one age into the next. The Bronze Age ended and the Iron Age began, carried on, their ships, carried in their memories. When refugees arrive, the world reshapes itself whether it wants to or not. And the Mediterranean, for all its beauty, has always been a mirror for that truth. Nothing drifts forever, and no harbour stays closed forever. If you listen to the waves there now, you might still hear them. The rhythm of oars, the whisper of sails. A language made of wind and water, saying what all travellers say when the horizon burns behind them. We had no choice. We went where the sea would let us. Egypt had survived what others could not. While the palaces of the north smouldered and the trade routes turned to dust, the Nile kept moving, slow, patient, as if the river didn't care who ruled its banks. The flood still came most years, though not always enough to feed everyone, and along its edges, under a sky bleached by too much sun, the empire of Rameses III gathered its last strength. You can imagine the scene, the pharaoh standing at the delta, where fresh water meets salt, the horizon broken by ships. Behind him, the fields of Egypt, before him, the hungry sea. The sea peoples were coming, hundreds of boats, filled with men and women, oxen, wagons, entire households floating toward the shore. To the Egyptians, it looked like invasion. To the newcomers, it was probably migration with weapons for insurance. History would call it war, but it may have begun as a crowd seeking somewhere that still grew green. Rameses was not the sort of man to wait quietly for whatever came next. He had temples to fill with victories, stone walls to write his immortality on, so he set a trap. His soldiers dug shallow defences in the delta marshes and hid among the reeds. Archers took their positions along the banks. Chariots waited just beyond the dunes. The pharaoh turned the mouth of the Nile into a labyrinth designed for one purpose: to remind the world that Egypt still remembered how to fight. The battle that followed is carved in perfect calm across the walls of Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple in Thebes. The reliefs are sharp enough that you can still trace the details with your fingertips, the curves of the ships, the tension in the bows, the way the water seems to ripple under stone waves. Each line says what every monument says: we were powerful, we were right, we were still here. But the stone also lies softly, tells only the parts worth remembering. The enemy fleet sailed into the delta expecting to land. They found the channels narrow, the wind pushing against them. From the banks, Egyptian archers released a storm of arrows. Their bronze tips flashed in the sun before vanishing into the tangled masts. The attackers tried to turn, but their ships collided. Oars tangled, sails tore, and the river filled with shouting. Egyptian sailors rowed out to meet them, using hooks to drag the ships closer, turning the battle into a floating melee. From above, the relief shows it all, in careful symmetry. Chaos turned into design. History's first illustrated naval ambush. In the end, Egypt won, or at least it declared that it did, which, in ancient politics, is nearly the same thing. The surviving invaders were captured or absorbed into Egyptian service. Their families were resettled on the frontiers, their weapons confiscated, their names carefully recorded. The pharaoh offered thanks to the gods, dedicated the victory to Amun, and ordered scribes to chisel every glorious detail into stone. He called it the Great Triumph, and for a moment it truly was. But victories have weight, and Egypt was already tired. The treasury, drained by decades of war, could no longer pay the workers who built the temples. The reliefs that celebrate triumph were carved by hands that hadn't eaten enough. At Deir el-Medina, the community of tomb builders went on strike, the first recorded labour strike in human history. Their complaint was simple: no food, no wages. It is a strangely modern protest in the middle of an ancient apocalypse. Imagine craftsmen sitting in the shade, refusing to carve the next scene of royal glory until someone brings them bread. Even the gods paused, waiting for payroll to resume. The empire's borders shrank, its grain stores ran thin. Once, Egypt had sent gold and armies north to control Canaan and Syria. Now it struggled to feed its own soldiers. Every year, fewer caravans arrived from abroad. The merchants who had once filled the harbours at Pyrameses found only empty docks and dust. Inscriptions from this time mention shortages so often that they begin to sound like prayers. And always, there is the same quiet refrain: the ships have not returned. Rameses III reigned for 31 years, long enough to outlive the very system he had defended. He built temples, kept order, and watched the world shrink around him. When he died, his own court officials conspired against him. A palace intrigue preserved on papyrus that reads like the script of a slow-motion collapse. Trials, accusations, confessions, and one exhausted line at the end. The plan was carried out. Egypt survived its enemies only to be eaten from within by hunger and paperwork. Even the monuments reflect the fatigue. The carvings at Medinet Habu are magnificent but oddly still. The figures don't move, they pose. The pharaoh towers above his captives, but his face is calm, almost detached, as if even victory had become a routine gesture. It's the smile of a man who knows that winning and enduring are not the same thing. By the century's end, Egypt was no longer an empire. Its reach had faded to the river valley, its gods grown local again. The temples still stood, but they were half empty, stone skeletons echoing with the sound of priests chanting to fewer listeners each year. In a world that had once been a chorus of empires, Egypt had become a single surviving note. And yet, there is something remarkable about that survival. When everything else turned to ash, Egypt adapted. It shrank instead of breaking. It withdrew into the rhythm of the Nile, trusting the river more than the kings. The people kept planting, kept praying, kept carving names into the same stone that had outlasted all their neighbours. They didn't rebuild an empire, they kept a heartbeat going. Sometimes endurance looks like decline from a distance. If you walk through Medinet Habu today, the air feels dry, almost warm enough to hum. You can still see the lines of the ships, the curve of the pharaoh's bow, the carved ripples of the Nile frozen in sunlight. It is the most detailed image of victory ever made by a civilization in the middle of losing itself. The gods of Egypt watched over that battle, and then slowly they too went quiet. But for one last moment, carved in stone, Egypt remembered how to roar. It didn't happen in a single night, or even a single year. But if history insists on one date, one dark pin in the map, it might be around 1177 before our era, a time when scribes stopped writing, traders stopped sailing, and the world's lights quietly went out one by one. Later generations would call it the collapse, though to those living through it, it must have felt less like an ending and more like a long, heavy pause. By then, the great cities had fallen like dominoes. Mycenae's walls cracked, its storerooms looted. Troy's ruins still smelled faintly of smoke. Hattusa was gone, its kings scattered, its archives baked by the fire that had destroyed them. Ugarit lay in ashes, its final letters cooling in their kiln. And Egypt, though technically victorious, was now a patient surviving on memory. If you had drawn the Mediterranean world on parchment that year, most of it would have been blank space and smoke. Archaeologists find it in the ground, a thin layer of black ash that lies like punctuation between centuries of brightness. Above it, new pottery, new tools, new people. Below it, the heavy silence of palaces that believed they could never fall. The layer is not thick, only a few inches in some places, about as deep as your hand, but it marks the border between the Bronze Age and everything that came after. To the eye, it looks like soot. To time, it looks like a sigh. In some cities, the end was loud. Walls collapsed, roofs burned, temples toppled. In others, it was slow. People simply stopped coming back. Farmers left for better fields, scribes for safer jobs, merchants for new harbours. Within a few decades, whole regions emptied. The roads turned to paths, and the paths turned to memories. If a traveller had walked those lands a century later, he would have found only ruins and rumours, names that people still used, though no one could say where they came from. Everywhere you look in the record, there's evidence of unmaking. In Alaka, Höyük and Karagolan, bodies lie beneath fallen beams, arrowheads still, lodged in their bones. In Mycenae, the citadel's once grand gates stand open, the lions above them staring down at nothing. In Cyprus, bronze workshops still hold half-finished tools, as if their workers had stepped out for a moment and never returned. And in the islands of the Aegean, the frescoes of dancing women fade into walls the colour of bone. No rebuilding, no reoccupation, just the slow reclaiming of order by dust. For a long time, scholars thought there must have been a single cause, a master disaster to explain so much loss. An earthquake, maybe, a plague, a revolution, a wave of invaders sweeping from the sea. But the evidence now points to something more complex and somehow more human. A world that depended too much on itself. Trade routes that were too long. Harvests that were too fragile. Kings who were too sure. When the rains failed, when the ships didn't arrive, when one link in the chain broke, the rest followed. It wasn't one catastrophe. It was a chorus of small ones harmonizing perfectly. If you listen to the ruins carefully, you can almost hear the tempo slow. A warehouse half full instead of full, a shipment delayed, a market empty for a week, then a month, then forever. The sound of civilization thinning out until there's only wind between the stones. And then, silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that waits for an echo that never returns. People must have wondered what they had done wrong. The gods were supposed to keep order. If the crops failed, it was because a ritual had been neglected. If the seas rose, someone had angered the storm god. So they prayed harder, sacrificed more, blamed one another, and hoped the old rhythms would resume. But they never did. When faith collides with climate, climate tends to win. You can sacrifice an ox to the gods, but you cannot bribe the wind. Somewhere in that long twilight, the world forgot how to write for a while. The scribes who had filled shells with clay and papyrus left no successors. When new rulers eventually rose centuries later, they spoke in different languages, used different alphabets, and remembered little of what came before. It's one of the great ironies of history. The most literate age in the ancient world ended in illiteracy. Knowledge, it turned out, was easier to burn than to rebuild. To the people who lived through it, the end of their age probably felt strangely practical. The lights went out slowly, one candle at a time. When a roof leaked, no one repaired it. When a road washed away, travellers took another path. When a scribe died, his students chose farming instead. Civilization didn't collapse in battle. It was quietly abandoned through 1,000 small decisions made by tired people. And yet, there is something oddly beautiful about how it ended. The great powers fell, but life did not. Villages survived. Farmers kept planting barley wherever the soil still answered. Blacksmiths began experimenting with a new metal. Iron, cheaper, simpler, born from necessity. The palaces turned to ash, but the idea of survival never did. Humanity, for all its mistakes, has always been good at starting over. When archaeologists brush away the dust today, they find small signs of that stubbornness. New pottery styles, rough but confident. Iron tools, crude but functional. Houses built not for show, but for shelter. It's the archaeology of humility. Proof that after grandeur comes adaptation. The late Bronze Age didn't vanish. It condensed into something smaller, hungrier, and ready to grow again. Standing at a dig site with the wind running through the stones, you realise that collapse is not the opposite of progress. It's the part that reminds us what progress costs. The cities that burned left room for others to rise. The languages that fell silent made way for new words. The end of one system was the clearing of the ground for another. You can call it failure, or you can call it pruning. If you ever visit one of those ruins, Mycenae, Hattusa or Ugarit, stay until dusk. The air cools, the stones change colour, and the silence feels almost alive. It isn't mourning, it's remembering. The ash in the soil still carries the faint scent of cedar and copper, the ghosts of ships, and the echo of voices that refused to believe the world could end. They were wrong about the permanence of their cities, but not about the persistence of their kind. So yes, around 1177 before our time, the lights went out. But the embers never did, and out of those embers, iron, alphabets, new gods, and new stories, the next world was already beginning to glow. Out of the ashes came a dull, stubborn glint, not gold, not bronze, but something darker and rougher, iron. For centuries it had been known, but ignored, too hard to melt, too impure to shape, too ordinary to impress a king. It existed on the edge of usefulness, like a servant no one noticed. But when the Bronze Age fell, and tin became a rumour whispered across burned-out trade routes, that dull metal began to matter. At first, people tried to keep the old ways alive. They hoarded bronze scraps, melted old tools, reforged weapons again and again until the metal grew brittle and grey. But every hammer strike sounded thinner. When the palaces were gone, the great foundries went silent. So the survivors turned to what they could find in their own soil. Black stones that glittered when heated, heavy chunks that resisted every tool but fire. Smelting iron was harder, less predictable, and required hotter furnaces. There was no formula, only trial and patience. In villages that no historian recorded, farmers became blacksmiths because they had no choice. And through those long, smoky nights, the future began to take shape. Iron was everywhere, hidden in the ground like a secret waiting for desperation to uncover it. Unlike bronze, it didn't need a network of miners, merchants, and kings. It needed only a single forge and someone stubborn enough to keep fanning the flames. The first usable bars were rough, full of impurities, but they held an advantage bronze never had. They were local. You didn't need permission from a palace to make them. You didn't need trade routes that stretched from Afghanistan to Cyprus. You needed fire, muscle, and time. That independence changed everything. Imagine a man in one of those new, quiet centuries, bent over a small pit furnace built from clay and stone. He pumps the bellows by hand, feeding the charcoal until the air glows orange. The metal inside begins to sweat and drip like candle wax. When he pulls it out, it's useless at first. A lump, dark and rough. He beats it anyway, over and over until sparks fly. Each strike drives out the weakness. Each breath of air makes it stronger. There is no alchemy here, no magic, just repetition. In that rhythm, he becomes something new. Not a worker for a palace, but a creator for himself. The sound of his hammer is the sound of freedom. Iron democratized survival. Anyone with enough fuel and endurance could make tools. Ploughs, knives, nails, spearheads. Crude at first, then better. The balance of the world began to tilt. The chariot lords of the Bronze Age, who once ruled from high walls behind teams of horses, now faced farmers who could forge their own blades. The monopoly of the elite melted as easily as their bronze weapons. The age of kings gave way to the age of blacksmiths. In a way, equality arrived not as an idea, but as a byproduct of metallurgy. Archaeologists can see the change in layers of soil. Above the ash of destruction, new artifacts appear. Iron sickles, small huts, handmade pottery. Civilization had gone smaller but not weaker. Where once there had been vast economies of luxury, there were now clusters of resilience. Communities built for endurance, not display. The people who survived the collapse no longer needed permission to exist. They had fire, and that was enough. When you hold an ancient iron blade today, it doesn't gleam like bronze or gold. It's darker, humbler, but it feels alive in the hand, as if it remembers being born from stubborn heat and sheer will. It oxidizes quickly, it rusts, it demands care. Bronze can last for millennia. Iron wants attention. It's as though the New Age required participation, not just inheritance. If the Bronze Age had been about order, the Iron Age was about persistence. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. To those who remembered the old world, iron must have seemed vulgar, common metal for common people. No shine, no prestige, no royal glow. But beauty follows necessity. Soon, kings learned to admire its strength, even if they missed its colour. New weapons replaced old ones. The armies that rose in these centuries fought on foot, shoulder to shoulder, with iron swords that could break the delicate bronze blades of the past. It was the beginning of a different kind of warfare, less graceful, more personal, and infinitely cheaper. A revolution measured not in ideas, but in impact. From this transformation, new societies emerged. The Philistines along the coast, the Aramaeans in the north, the small kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and the city-states of Greece, all grew from the ashes left behind by the Bronze Age. Each spoke new languages, worshipped new gods, and used iron tools. The world had lost its empires, but it had gained its ancestors. These were the people who would later build the classical civilizations we still remember. The fall of the Bronze Age had not erased humanity. It had simply reset its ambitions. Even writing began to change. The complex cuneiform scripts of old, with their thousands of signs, were replaced by alphabets. Simpler, faster, easier to learn. You could teach a child to write now. You didn't need a royal school or a scribe's apprenticeship. Information had become portable again. Just as iron freed the hands, the alphabet freed the voice. A village could now remember itself without a palace. It was a small miracle disguised as practicality. When you think of progress, you probably imagine brightness, more light, more brilliance. But this progress was darker, quieter, like iron itself. It didn't glow in the sun, it glowed in the forge. It wasn't glorious, it was sustainable. Humanity learned that survival wasn't about beauty, but about endurance. And endurance, it turns out, has its own kind of shine. If you stand in a museum today and look at a row of ancient weapons, bronze, then iron, you can see the transition like the passing of a torch. The bronze is delicate, smooth, and ceremonial. The iron is blunt, workmanlike, a little uneven, but it feels closer to you. It looks like something that belongs to real hands. In that shift, the human story changes tone. Less orchestra, more heartbeat. The world had burned, but out of the smoke a simpler, stronger music began. And so the Iron Age arrived. Not with triumph, but with persistence. It wasn't the rebirth of civilization. It was its reintroduction to humility. The empires were gone, but the villages endured. The palaces had crumbled, but the forges sang. From dust and rust, people found a way to start again. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but permanently. Iron didn't just shine, it endured. And that, more than anything, was what the new world needed most. Long after the fires had cooled, the world kept one final irony for Egypt. The kingdom that had outlasted drought, invasion, and the end of the Bronze Age found itself undone by the smallest thing imaginable. Late payments. Not armies, not earthquakes, not gods. Just wages, grain, and the quiet fury of hungry craftsmen. It happened in a place called Deir el-Medina, a village that existed for one purpose only, to build tombs for eternity. Its people were the artists, masons, and carpenters who carved the walls of the Valley of the Kings. They knew the names of pharaohs better than anyone because they were the ones who wrote them into stone. And they knew how to measure time because they spent their lives building monuments meant to defeat it. If anyone understood permanence, it was them. Which is why it's so ironic that they became the first people in recorded history to go on strike. For decades, Deir el-Medina had been well fed and well paid. Each worker received monthly rations of grain, a fair exchange for sculpting immortality. They lived in neat houses, raised families, and filled their walls with sketches of daily life. Women baking bread, children playing, cats stealing fish. But by the reign of Rameses III, the supplies began to arrive late. The palaces were stretched thin, the granaries almost empty. Some workers had gone 20 days without their allotment. The scribes, ever diligent, wrote a note of complaint to the overseers. It was polite at first, then firmer, then it turned into something new. They stopped working. Imagine it. The builders of the afterlife sitting cross-legged in the dust, tools on the ground, their chisels silent. The tombs of kings stood half-finished, the walls blank where hymns should have been. The echo of their work, which had once sounded like eternity itself, vanished from the cliffs. For the first time in thousands of years, even the dead had to wait. The overseers panicked. This wasn't rebellion. It was something stranger. Bureaucracy breaking from within. The workers weren't asking for freedom or power. They wanted lunch. When even eternity's employees demand bread before immortality, you know the system has forgotten how to feed itself. One scribe wrote that they gathered at the temple gates shouting their demands. Another noted that they refused to go home until someone listened. It's both heroic and faintly absurd. The world's first labour protest conducted in the shadow of gods carved into stone. Eventually the officials relented. A messenger arrived with sacks of grain and a promise that everything would soon return to normal. The men picked up their tools again, the chisel struck the walls, and eternity resumed production. But the cracks were already visible, not in the tombs, but in the confidence of the system itself. For a brief moment, the builders of the dead had reminded the living that even divine order runs on logistics. The story of Deir el-Medina reads like a fable written by an exhausted accountant. The collapse of empire reduced to balance sheets and back pay. It's tempting to laugh, but there's something haunting about it too. The priests still performed their rituals, the pharaoh still issued decrees, and yet the world's oldest government couldn't get a delivery on time. When historians later uncovered the papier describing the strike, they found not drama but procedure, petitions, signatures, receipts. Apocalypse wasn't loud, it was bureaucratic. In those same records you can trace the slow unravelling of trust. A shipment of grain shorted by a tenth, a worker caught stealing food from storage, supervisors arguing over who was responsible. Each document written with the same tidy handwriting that once recorded the triumphs of kings. It's almost funny if it weren't so universal. Every civilization eventually learns that paperwork lasts longer than power. The village survived for another century, though just barely. Its houses grew emptier, its records thinner. When a generation of craftsmen died, their sons didn't replace them. The tombs became simpler, the walls less detailed. By the time of the late dynasties, Egypt had stopped building monuments for eternity. It had started building for necessity. Even the gods, once monumental, began to look tired. But within that exhaustion lies a strange grace. Deir el-Medina was not destroyed by war or famine. It simply slowed down until it became part of the desert. The wind filled its streets, the sand softened its walls, and time, always patient, reclaimed it. Archaeologists who uncovered it thousands of years later found graffiti of jokes and complaints still scratched into the plaster. One doodle shows a cat leading a procession of geese, another shows a worker sleeping under a tree. It seems, even in decline, humour survived. The people who carved the ceilings of kings also left behind cartoons of themselves napping on the job. If you walk through the site today, it feels small and strangely intimate. The houses are close together, the alleys narrow. You can see where someone once cooked bread, where another stored water. You can still imagine the murmur of conversation, small grievances, small kindnesses, the rhythm of survival. The silence there is not tragic. It's familiar. The kind of quiet that follows when a long task has finally been finished. In a way, Deir el-Medina is the perfect symbol for how the ancient world ended, not with rebellion, but with fatigue. Its workers stopped not because they hated their rulers, but because they were hungry. Its rulers failed not because they were cruel, but because the system they inherited no longer worked. Collapse doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sighs. When even the builders of eternity stop showing up for work, something has gone wrong. but something else has also gone right. They had learned, however briefly, that the right to rest is its own kind of immortality. In the dust of Egypt's last functioning palace, humanity found something older than gods or kings. The quiet insistence that survival should include fairness. And so, the Bronze Age ended not only with fire and silence, but also with a petition and a missing lunch. A small story, written on papyrus, carried across time to remind us that even the mightiest civilizations are maintained by ordinary people who occasionally need to eat before they build forever. When the hammers finally stopped and the chisels went quiet, the world entered a kind of silence it hadn't known in 1,000 years. No more letters between kings, no shipments crossing the sea, no scribes pressing clay with lists of what the sun would soon forget. What remained were fields gone to weeds, roads fading into the dust, and languages that no one remembered how to pronounce. The historians later called it a dark age, though the darkness was not of evil, but of absence, a pause between sentences when the storyteller takes a breath. Imagine walking through one of those abandoned cities. The walls still stand, but the roofs are gone. Grass grows between flagstones that once felt the tread of royal processions. An olive tree leans through what used to be a doorway, its roots wrapped around a fallen column. The air smells of dust and time. Everything is quiet enough to hear your own breath. You realise with a slow kind of awe that memory itself has weathered away. The gods are unremembered, the rulers unnamed, the archives unreadable. It is as if time decided to wipe the slate clean and start again, gently but thoroughly. For the people who lived through it, life went on, smaller, rougher, but still life. They planted what they could, fished where the water still flowed, traded in short distances instead of across continents. They didn't call it a collapse, they called it another day. They were too busy surviving to notice they'd become history's footnotes. No one writes epic poetry while counting seeds. When archaeologists dig through these centuries, they find very little to hold on to. Pottery mostly. Plain, undecorated, made for use, not beauty. It's as if the world collectively decided that ornament could wait. There are gaps in the record so wide that entire generations vanish into them. A town appears in one layer of soil, and in the next it's gone. No fire, no bodies, no explanation. Just absence. Civilization became shy, hiding itself in plain sight. The scholars who named it the Dark Age meant it as a statement of ignorance, our ignorance, not theirs. But the phrase fits in another way too. It was dark the way soil is dark, rich, quiet, waiting. The world was resting, recovering from its own overreach. The fields that had been stripped by centuries of over-farming began to heal. Forests crept back along forgotten roads. The land exhaled, and in that long silence, the next version of humanity took its first slow breath. The languages changed first. Cuneiform, the written voice of the Bronze Age, disappeared. It had been too complicated. Hundreds of signs for hundreds of words, each requiring years of training. When the scribes died, their art died with them. The few who tried to keep it alive wrote into emptiness. There were no readers left. Writing itself went quiet for a century or more. When it returned, it had simplified, as though the human mind had grown, tired of ceremony, letters instead of symbols, sounds instead of pictures. The alphabet, smaller, lighter, portable. The language of a world that no longer trusted palaces. In this age, stories changed too. The epics of kings and gods gave way to local myths told around fires. Every village invented its own origin, its own small eternity. They remembered heroes as neighbours, gods as travellers, history as gossip. The grandeur of empire faded into rumour. Somewhere in those dim years, the idea of civilization quietly redefined itself. Less about monuments, more about persistence. If you were born in that time, you might not have known that anything had been lost. You would have grown up among ruins, but to you they would have seemed like hills or cliffs, just part of the landscape. You might have built your house beside a toppled column without caring who once owned it. You might have ploughed a field over the bones of a forgotten army. The past would have been everywhere and nowhere, like a language you could hear but not speak. Archaeologists call these centuries a hiatus, as though history simply stopped keeping minutes for a while. But people were still there, tired, clever, endlessly adaptive. The Dark Age wasn't the death of humanity, it was its hibernation. What we call silence was, to them, a long conversation with the earth. They learned again how to live without the noise of empire, how to listen to seasons instead of kings. It's tempting to pity them, to imagine their lives as grey and diminished. But maybe it was a kind of freedom. Without distant rulers or demanding gods, life became immediate again. Every sunrise was local, every meal was personal. History had collapsed into daily life, and daily life became sacred again. No one had time for the illusion of eternity. They had barley to harvest and water to find. And perhaps that was enough. Centuries later, when civilization returned, it did so humbler and wiser. The people who rebuilt the cities no longer used the same designs. The temples were smaller, the writing quicker, the economy simpler. They had learned that the world could vanish, and so they built lightly, like travellers camping for the night. That lesson would echo through every empire that followed, though of course, most would forget it in time. If you stand among the ruins today, you can still feel the patience of that forgotten era. The stones are warm in the sun, the air dry, the silence vast but gentle. This was the century when humanity for once stopped shouting and simply listened, to the soil, to the wind, to itself. A world catching its breath after a long fever. Archaeology calls it a hiatus. The locals probably called it hunger, but maybe the earth called it healing. And in that long drought of memory, something essential survived, the instinct to begin again. The first signs of recovery didn't arrive with trumpets or grand declarations. They arrived as small sounds, the clang of iron on stone, the scratch of a reed on clay, the murmur of traders testing new routes across familiar seas. Civilization, it turned out, didn't need a second coming. It needed breakfast, tools, and a reason to talk again. From the edges of the old world, new names began to appear. The Phoenicians along the coast of what is now Lebanon, the Aramaeans in the north, rebuilding among the ruins of forgotten palaces, small tribes of Israelites carving out fields among the hills, and across the sea the early Greeks, their language still raw, their myths still forming. None of them thought of themselves as heirs to anything grand. They were simply doing what humans always do after a storm, picking up what still worked. The iron tools helped. They were blunt, cheap, and abundant. The perfect antidote to nostalgia. A single blacksmith with a hot enough furnace could now make what once required an empire. Ploughs cut deeper into the soil, axes felled trees that had reclaimed the roads, and knives replaced the stone edges people had used in the darkest years. It was messy progress, but it stuck. Iron had no beauty, but it had endurance, and endurance had become the only beauty that mattered. Trade followed soon after. The Phoenicians, restless and clever, began building ships again. They sailed west into the unknown, following coastlines, mapping islands, and founding colonies. They brought timber from the mountains, purple dye from the sea snails of their shores, and ideas from everyone they met. In the ruins of the Bronze Age economy, they invented something simpler: exchange without empires, commerce without kings. Their ships were smaller than the old cargo fleets, but they carried something far more valuable than tin or copper. They carried words. Because somewhere between all the burnt archives and forgotten tablets, humanity rediscovered how to write. But this time, it did it differently. The alphabet appeared, a set of signs so elegant and simple that anyone could learn it. No longer hundreds of symbols to memorize, no longer a profession reserved for scribes and priests, just a handful of sounds, enough to capture a voice. The Phoenicians spread it like a quiet contagion to traders, sailors, and storytellers. From them, the Greeks borrowed it, shaped it, and later passed it to others. It was the most democratic invention in history, a way for memory to belong to everyone. If cuneiform had been the language of palaces, the alphabet was the language of taverns. You could carve it on wood, scratch it on pottery, or paint it on a wall. You didn't need an education to remember your own name. A fisherman could keep accounts. A farmer could leave a message. Writing was no longer a ceremony, it was conversation. The world had learned that survival required communication, and communication required simplicity. The alphabet was history's way of saying, let's make writing less heavy. With writing came stories again, shorter, rougher, but more honest. The Greeks sang of wanderers and tricksters, not kings. The Israelites wrote of law, struggle, and covenant, survival made sacred. The Phoenicians recorded trade routes and port lists. The Aramaeans used their language to stitch together cultures across deserts. Each new alphabet became a bridge, built one sound at a time. The Bronze Age had tried to make meaning eternal. The Iron Age made it portable. You can trace the rebirth almost entirely through small gestures. A potter's mark on a jar, a name carved into a wall, a scratched alphabet on a child's toy. Each one says the same thing. We remember. And remembering in that fragile time was an act of defiance. The new societies were humbler. No great palaces, no sprawling bureaucracies, no monuments trying to outlast the sun. Their gods were local again, their temples small, their politics personal. They had learned what happens when complexity grows faster than compassion. So they built their world like a woven basket, flexible, practical, able to bend without breaking. When one village failed, another took its place. When one crop died, another was planted. They survived not because they were powerful, but because they stopped pretending they needed to be. This was not a rebirth of grandeur, but a rebirth of balance. Iron tools made the soil productive, the alphabet made memory possible, and the sea once again carried more than wreckage. Ships sailed with painted eyes on their bows, as if remembering the ghosts of those that had burned before. The Phoenicians reached as far as North Africa and Spain, planting small colonies like seeds in foreign soil. Each harbour lit a tiny lamp of connection, and slowly the Mediterranean began to glow again. Even art returned, though quietly. The early Greek pottery of this period is simple. Dark figures against red clay, human forms rediscovering motion. After centuries of silence, people began to draw themselves again. No longer gods towering over mortals, but people eating, dancing, holding hands. It was as if civilization had learned humility, and with it, empathy. Beauty, once trapped in palaces, had found its way back into kitchens. If you step back and look at this period, it seems modest compared to the entries before, but modesty is exactly what kept it alive. These people didn't build empires, they built continuity. They didn't worship permanence, they worshipped adaptability. The alphabet, the iron tool, the open ship. Each was small, but together they formed a new foundation for the next 1,000 years. When dawn rose over the Mediterranean again, it looked almost ordinary. Farmers in the fields, sailors adjusting their sails, children learning to write the first letters of their names in wet clay. The world had changed its handwriting, but not its heartbeat. And from the ruins came shorter words and lighter swords, the beginning of everything that would follow. The Bronze Age had fallen under its own weight. The Iron Age, by contrast, would stand by being light. It was less about glory and more about endurance, about people who had learned that the surest way to survive eternity is not to chase it. It is to stay small, stay useful, stay kind. And so, across the coasts and valleys once burned to ash, ships began to sail again. Their sails caught the same old wind, but it carried a new tune, a language that anyone could learn and a metal that anyone could forge. The alphabet shimmered on every surface like scattered light, a promise that history was still whispering. And in that whisper, the new world began to hum. Every civilization leaves behind two things: ruins and reasons. The ruins are easy to find: stones, pottery, burn layers, the shapes of forgotten streets. The reasons are harder. They hide in the pauses between events, in the slow choices people make without knowing they are building or unbuilding their future. The late Bronze Age collapsed for 100 reasons, none of them simple, but what it left us is clear, a reminder that complexity is beautiful and temporary. The world that fell had been magnificent, a web of kingdoms bound by trade, diplomacy and confidence. It had ships faster than the wind, palaces glittering with imported goods, archives filled with letters exchanged between kings who called each other brother. It had bureaucracy so advanced that every loaf of bread and jar of oil was recorded on clay. And that was its flaw. It worked too well for too long, until the system itself became the only god anyone really trusted. When one thread snapped, the rest followed. It wasn't a moral failure, it was a mechanical one. And when the mechanism stopped turning, so did the world. You can still see the fingerprints of that faith in complexity in the layers of ash. Each burned city was a node in the same network, each dependent on the others for grain, metal, or meaning. When drought hit one coast, famine crossed the sea. When one port failed to send tin, 10 palaces ran out of bronze. It's easy, from the safety of centuries, to ask why they didn't see it coming. But perhaps they did, and like us, they simply hoped the next shipment would arrive. Every age thinks it's permanent until one small link breaks. For them, it was the tin route from the east. For us, it might be something else. The quiet dependencies that hold the modern world together: trade, energy, data, trust. Different materials, same pattern. History doesn't repeat, but it does enjoy rhyming. And yet, the Bronze Age didn't vanish into tragedy. It transformed. The ashes of its collapse fertilized what came next. Smaller societies, simpler tools, and new alphabets that carried memory forward. Its death gave birth to our vocabulary for survival. The word resilience had no meaning then, but they practiced it instinctively. They learned that, after grandeur, humility is not weakness. It is wisdom with the noise turned down. In every burned layer, archaeologists find signs of adaptation. A rebuilt house over an older ruin. A cooking pot repaired with iron staples. A field planted on the rubble of a temple. Civilization, like a vine, grows best when it has something broken to climb on. The ruins were not endings, they were scaffolds for what came next. There's a quiet comfort in knowing that even collapse leaves instructions. The first is, nothing lasts forever. The second, it doesn't need to. Every empire imagines itself eternal, but eternity is a trick of the calendar. A century of peace feels infinite until the rains stop. A dynasty of kings feels divine until the accountants stop being paid. Then everything becomes what it always was. Temporary arrangements of stone and hope. When you stand among the ruins today, Hattusa, Ugarit, Mycenae, the valley tombs of Egypt, you can still feel the weight of that lesson. The wind moves through the corridors like breath. The sun warms the walls that once held kings. The silence is not empty. It hums faintly, like a memory almost ready to speak. Each place seems to whisper the same message. We were sure it would last. And then softer. We were wrong. But they were also right about something. They believed that what is written endures, and in a way it did. Their letters still speak, their art still glows, their mistakes still teach. Even their absence teaches. That forgetting is not failure, but space for new remembering. Civilization is a rhythm, not a monument. It rises, falters, rests, and begins again, never quite the same, always slightly better at surviving itself. If the Bronze Age has a moral, it is not that greatness is fragile, but that fragility itself can be a kind of greatness. A world so intricate that a single drought could unmake it was also a world capable of breathtaking collaboration. Its collapse wasn't the end of cooperation, it was the price of it. To connect everything is to risk losing everything together, but to not connect is worse, so we keep building webs again and again, even knowing how they tear. It's easy to laugh at their faith in bronze and gods of weather and grain. But our faith in progress isn't so different. We still trust in our networks, our technologies, our invisible threads. And maybe that's fine, as long as we remember that all systems have a breaking point, and that beauty lies in how we adapt when they do. The Bronze Age didn't end because they ran out of metal. It ended because they ran out of luck. But luck, like the rain, always returns eventually. When it did, the world was smaller, humbler, more local, but still a world. Children still played, fires still burned, words still found a way to be written down. That's all history ever promises, not immortality, just continuation. If you listen closely to the wind over those ancient ruins, you can still hear the faint echo of waves against lost harbours. It sounds like breathing. It sounds like survival. It sounds like a whisper that has outlived its speakers. We were here, we learned, we began again, and still the ash remembers.